Welcome. If you are a state, local, tribal, territorial government, or any other eligible FEMA grant recipient or subrecipient, this video tutorial will help you understand how to properly contract during emergency or exigent circumstances when using federal funds. This tutorial will help you gain a general knowledge of the federal procurement regulations, increase your awareness of potential risk areas, and introduce you to the resources available to assist you throughout your procurement process. We will dive into hot topics such as contracting requirements in emergency or exigent circumstances, as well as how to use pre-existing contracts in line with the federal procurement rules. This video tutorial is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice.
Federal grant recipients and subrecipients will often use contractors to help them carry out work under their FEMA grant award. These contracts are commercial transactions between the applicants and their contractors, and FEMA has no contractual relationship between the two. Although FEMA is not a party to these contracts, if an applicant is using federal funding to pay for the contract, it must comply with federal laws, including the federal procurement regulations. The federal procurement regulations found at 2 CFR sections 200.317 through 326 apply to contracts under FEMA grant programs associated with eligible work performed on or after December 26, 2014. The uniform rules objectives are not restricted to ensuring that costs are low and reasonable. As you will quickly notice, some of these rules aim to promote environmental protection goals and participation among diverse businesses to use federal funds more equitably. Failure to include federal contracting requirements when procuring goods and services and selecting contractors puts applicants at risk of not receiving full reimbursement for associated eligible costs.
An applicant's required contracting actions will vary depending on the applicant entity type. So the first step an applicant must take is to determine whether they are a state or non-state entity. Applicants should be sure to consult their legal counsel if they have any questions regarding their entity type.
A state entity is defined as any state or territory of the United States and any agencies or instrumentality of that state or territory. This definition is not inclusive of local governments or tribal governments. State entities must follow the procurement procedures found at 2 CFR 200.317, which include following the same policies and procedures they use for procurements from their non-federal funds, complying with Environmental Protection Agency guidelines applicable to the use of recovered materials found at 2 CFR 200.322, and including all necessary contract provisions as required by 2 CFR 200.326. A non-state entity is any eligible FEMA grant applicant that does not meet the definition of a state. This includes local and tribal governments, institutions of higher education, hospitals, other private nonprofit organizations, and houses of worship. Non-state entities must follow their own procurement policies and procedures, which reflect applicable state or tribal law and ensure all procurements comply with the federal procurement regulations at 2 CFR 200.318 through 326. If, however, there is a difference between the entity's rules and the federal standards, applicants must follow the rule that allows for compliance at all levels. In some cases, this may mean the most restrictive rule. Applicants should note that the standards at 2 CFR 200.318 through 326 only address a small portion of rules that can possibly apply to a non-state procurement. If the federal rules do not address a concept, the non-state entity should seek guidance from their own rules.
The regulation at 2 CFR section 200.319 requires that procurements be conducted in a manner ensuring full and open competition. Full and open competition means that all responsible contractors are permitted to submit a sealed bid or proposal in response to the solicitation. There are numerous benefits to full and open competition. These include increasing the probability of receiving the lowest, most effective cost option from the most qualified contractor, preventing favoritism, collusion, fraud, waste, and abuse, and allowing the opportunity for small and minority firms, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms to participate in federally funded work. Non-state entities must also ensure they have written procurement procedures governing their procurement transactions. These procedures must ensure that all solicitation documents incorporate a clear and accurate description of the goods or services being procured. These descriptions must not unduly restrict competition. Non-state entities must comply with one of the 5 methods of procurement set forth at 2 CFR section 200.320. These include micro-purchase procedures, which can be used when acquiring goods or services totaling no more than $10,000, small purchase procedures, which can be used when procuring goods or services totaling no more than the simplified acquisition threshold currently set at $250,000, and sealed bidding or competitive proposals, which can be used for any procurements over the simplified acquisition threshold. Applicants may also use a non-competitive method of procurement regardless of dollar amount, also known as sole sourcing, in only 4 circumstances. For purposes of this presentation, we will only focus on sole sourcing during emergency or exigent circumstances. Applicants should remember that federal thresholds are periodically adjusted for inflation. Ensure these periodic changes are reflected in your entity's procurement policies and procedures. Additionally, for procurements over $250,000, independent estimates are required prior to receiving offers, as well as performing a price or cost analysis. These requirements are in place even when sole sourcing due to emergency or exigent circumstances. A non-competitive procurement or sole source procurement is a special case in which full and open competition is not required. This method of procurement is only allowable in 4 situations, one of them being when an applicant is facing a public emergency or exigent circumstance. Emergency and exigent circumstances are situations that will not permit a delay resulting from the full and open competition process. Although the terms are often used interchangeably, emergency and exigency are not necessarily the same. An emergency is an unexpected and unusually dangerous situation that calls for immediate action or an urgent need for assistance or relief. For instance, threat to life, public health or safety, improved property, or some other form of dangerous situation. One example includes: a severed power line remains live and is dangling near an apartment building. If not addressed immediately, this live wire poses a risk of igniting the building on fire or causing bodily harm. The emergency would not extend to repair and restoration of the city's power lines beyond the resolution of this limited, dangerous situation. An exigency, on the other hand, does not involve a threat to life, safety, or property, but involves a threat to other important community needs, often related to the need to reopen schools or avert an extreme economic crisis. One example includes: an applicant used a non-competitive procurement in advance of a large sporting event to remove debris blocking the roadways. If not removed immediately, the debris threatened to force cancellation of this major economic activity for the region. The exigency only existed up until the day that the tournament started. Full and open competition was required for procurements after the commencement of the tournament. The use of either of these exceptions is limited and only permissible during the period of actual emergency or exigency. Once this period ends, the non-state applicant must transition to a procurement compliant with the requirements of full and open competition. The applicant must also be prepared to provide a justification fully documenting the emergency or exigent circumstance.
Now, let's consider sole sourcing in the context of COVID-19. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services determined that a nationwide public health emergency exists and has existed since January 27, 2020, as a result of the coronavirus disease 2019, also known as COVID-19. On March 13th, the President issued a nationwide emergency declaration for COVID-19. And these declarations established that exigent and emergency circumstances currently exist. To clarify what this means for FEMA award recipients and subrecipients, FEMA issued a memo and fact sheet on March 17th addressing procurements made during periods of exigent or emergency circumstances. The main takeaway from the memo is that for the duration of the current federal public health emergency, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic qualifies as an exigent and emergency circumstance. Therefore, non-state entities are permitted to sole source contracts in accordance with 2 CFR 200.320 F2 for the duration of the COVID-19 public health emergency as determined by Health and Human Services. Keep in mind that the emergency and exigency exception to full and open competition does not apply to state entities. States, unlike non-state entities, must follow their own documented procurement policies and procedures pursuant to 2 CFR 200.317, including procurements under emergency circumstances. The procurement under grants conducted under emergency and exigent circumstances fact sheet and additional COVID-19 guidance are available at www.fema.gov/procurement-disaster-assistance-team. Let's go over the requirements for non-state entities that intend to sole source contracts under exigent and emergency circumstances for COVID-19. We will provide a general overview and then expand on each of the requirements. If sole sourcing under emergency or exigent circumstances, non-state entities must only use these contracts during the defined period of emergency or exigency, and once this period is over, non-state entities must transition to a contract that has gone through full and open competition. The period of emergency or exigency is still ongoing and will end once the Health and Human Services determines the public health emergency no longer exists. Applicants must provide justification for the need to use this non-competitive method of procurement. The fact sheet contains suggested elements for justification you can use. For contracts that exceed or are expected to exceed the simplified acquisition thresholds, non-state applicants must complete a cost or price analysis pursuant to 2 CFR 200.326. This is to determine that the cost or price of the contract is fair and reasonable. Additionally, for contracts that exceed the simplified acquisition threshold and are for construction or facility improvement projects, non-state applicants must follow federal bonding requirements as outlined in 2 CFR 200.325. When sole sourcing under emergency or exigent circumstances, non-state entities must also include the required contract clauses found at 2 CFR 200.326. They must ensure time and material contracts comply with the requirements set forth at 2 CFR 200.318. Avoid the use of cost plus percentage of cost contracts. These contract types are strictly prohibited by the rules. Additionally, the non-state entity must also comply with the general procurement requirements in 2 CFR 200.318, including the requirement to only award contracts to responsible contractors, maintain oversight, and have documented procedures to avoid potential and/or real conflicts of interest. In some cases, a state, local, or tribal law allows for the waiver of procurement requirements when an emergency is declared. However, these laws only allow for the waiver of the applicant, state, local, and/or tribal procurement rules. A non-state applicant must still abide by the federal procurement regulations under 2 CFR sections 200.317 through 326.
Let's go over some details about the requirements for non-state entities. A non-state entity must perform a cost or price analysis in connection with every procurement action above the simplified acquisition threshold, including contract modifications, as required by 2 CFR section 200.323. The method and degree of analysis is dependent on the facts and circumstances surrounding the procurement. But as a starting point, the non-state entity must make independent estimates before receiving bids or proposals. A cost analysis is the review and evaluation of the separate cost elements such as labor hours, overhead, materials, etc., and proposed profit to determine a fair and reasonable cost for a contract. On the other hand, a price analysis is the examination and evaluation of a proposed price without evaluating its separate cost elements and proposed profit. When conducting a cost or price analysis, A non-state entity shall negotiate profit in all cases where a cost analysis is performed, and as a separate element of the total price for each sole-sourced contract during emergency or exigent circumstances. Keep in mind that documentation of cost or price analysis can be useful as evidence that costs are reasonable. Bonding requirements are applicable to construction or facility improvement contracts exceeding the simplified acquisition threshold. 2 CFR Section 200.325 outlines the 3 types of bonds non-state entities must be aware of. These include a bid guarantee. Each bidder must provide a bid guarantee equivalent to 5% of the bid price. Performance bond. There must be a performance bond on the part of the contractor for 100% of the contract price. Payment bond. There must be a payment bond on the part of the contractor for 100% of the contract price. Non-state entities should ensure that their bonding requirements do not unduly restrict competition.
2 CFR Section 200.326 requires that non-state entity as well as state entity contracts contain certain contract provisions. These provisions are described in Appendix 2 to Part 200. Failure to include the required contract provisions is one of the most common findings of non-compliance for both state and non-state entities. You can use the contract provisions template available on the PDAT website at www.fema.gov/procurement-disaster-assistance-team for additional guidance including required contract provisions, sample language, and insight about which provisions might apply under different circumstances. Section 1225 of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act prohibits FEMA from reimbursing applicants that include contract language preventing the FEMA Administrator or the Comptroller General of the United States from auditing or otherwise reviewing all aspects related to the contract. Public assistance applicants must not include such language prohibiting access to records in any contract entered into after August 1st, 2017.
A time and materials contract is a contract whose costs are the sum of the actual cost of materials plus direct labor hours charged at fixed hourly rates. A non-state entity may only use a time and materials contract after determining that no other contract type is suitable. The contract includes a ceiling price that the contractor exceeds at its own risk, and the applicant maintains a high degree of oversight to prevent unnecessary cost overruns. Additionally, use of time and materials contracts is generally limited to a reasonable time based on the circumstances during which the applicant cannot define a clear scope of work. Once the scope of work becomes clear, applicants must transition to a more acceptable contract type. A cost plus percentage of cost contract is a cost reimbursement contract containing some element that obligates the applicant to pay the contractor an amount undetermined at the time the contract was made and to be incurred in the future based on a percentage of future costs. This contract type is prohibited because there is no incentive for a contractor to control costs, and the contractor is able to increase its profits by increasing cost of performance. To determine if you are dealing with this type of contract, ask yourself if payment is on a predetermined percentage rate. The predetermined percentage rate is applied to actual performance costs. The contractor's profit is uncertain at the time of contracting, and the contractor's profit increases with increased performance costs. This contract type is prohibited even in emergency or exigent circumstances. Any costs incurred under this contract type risk their FEMA award reimbursement. A non-state entity must award contracts only to responsible contractors possessing the ability to perform successfully under the terms and conditions of a proposed procurement. Matters to be considered include contractor integrity, compliance with public policy, record of past performance, and whether the contractor has demonstrated having the financial and technical resources to complete the work. Once the applicant has determined the contractor to be responsible, they must visit www.sam.gov to confirm that the contractor has not been suspended or debarred from performing work funded by the federal government. State and non-state entities must not make any award or permit any award to contractors listed as suspended or debarred on sam.gov. This requirement also applies to work performed in emergency or exigent circumstances. The applicant should be sure to document that they have taken this step.
There are 11 general procurement standards that apply to non-state entity contracting actions in work that is to be reimbursed by the federal government. 8 of the general procurement standards are mandatory and 3 are encouraged. The mandatory provisions include contractor oversight, which means to ensure that contractors perform in accordance with the terms, conditions, and specifications of their contracts or purchase orders. Number 2 is necessity. Non-state entities must have procedures that avoid the acquisition of unnecessary or duplicative supplies or services. Number 3, standards of conduct. Applicants must maintain written standards of conduct covering conflicts of interest and governing the actions of employees engaged in the selection, award, and administration of the contracts. Number 4, conflict of interest. No employee, officer, or agent may participate in the selection, award, or administration of a contract supported by a federal award if he or she has a real or apparent conflict of interest. Number 5, gifts. The officers, employees, and agents of the non-federal entities must neither solicit nor accept gratuities, favors, or anything else of monetary values from contractors or subcontractors. Number 6, award to responsible contractors. Number 7, maintain records sufficient to detail the history of the procurement. Number 8, settlement of issues. The entity must have written procedures in place outlining procedures for the settlement of all contractual issues and administrative issues arising out of the procurements. The uniform rules also include 3 encouraged procurement standards. They include use of intergovernmental agreements, use of GSA's Federal Excess Surplus Property Donation Program, and the use of value engineering clauses. For additional information on the general procurement standards, please see Chapter 3 of the PDAT Field Manual.
CFR Section 200.318 subsection I requires the maintenance of records sufficient enough to detail the entire history of procurement. These records should include, but are not limited to, the rationale for the method of procurement used for each contract, including a justification for using any procurement by non-competitive proposal methods, the rationale for selecting the type of contract used, the rationale for contractor selection or rejection, and the rationale for the contract price. Always ensure procurement records are retained for the minimum time frame dictated by local, state, and federal requirements, and at least 3 years from the date of submission of the final expenditure report for the award. Failure to properly document may jeopardize your FEMA grant funding. If a pre-awarded or pre-existing contract is not in compliance with the federal procurement requirements, it may still be possible to use the contract for the duration of the exigent or emergency circumstance. FEMA recommends that non-state entities review the list of procurement requirements previously discussed and take actions to modify pre-awarded or pre-existing contracts where applicable. In addition, non-state entities must prepare the appropriate documentation to justify the use of a non-competitively procured contract.
Let's go over the requirements for state entities regardless of exigent and emergency circumstances. As a reminder, 2 CFR 200.317 requires states to follow the same policies and procedures as they use for procurements using non-federal funds. They must also comply with the procurement of recovered materials requirements and include all required contract provisions in any contracts. These requirements apply regardless of whether exigency or emergency circumstances exist. States must ensure that they are also in compliance with the cost principles at 2 CFR section 200.400, including ensuring that costs are reasonable as defined in 2 CFR section 200.404. Additionally, while the federal procurement rules do not prohibit the use of time and materials contracts and cost plus percentage of cost contracts by states, FEMA discourages states from using these contracts because they generally lack provisions that control costs and maximize efficiency in performing work. FEMA and the Office of Inspector General closely scrutinize these types of contracts for cost reasonableness.
There are numerous resources available to help guide you through the procurement under grant process. To explore the federal procurement rules, visit ecfr.gov and search 2 CFR sections 200.317 through 200.326. Visit the PDAP website at fema.gov/procurement-disaster-assistance-team to explore many helpful resources such as a contract provisions template, an in-depth field manual, and more. Use sam.gov to confirm you are not entering into a covered transaction with a party listed on the government-wide exclusions list. Applicants should also take advantage of the many points of contact, including your local procurement staff and local legal counsel. You can also reach your state emergency management agency and FEMA regional representative to guide you throughout the grant contracting process. This concludes the video tutorial. Thank you for your participation.